There's something quietly powerful about people who genuinely enjoy being alone. It's not that they hate people or avoid connection. It's that solitude doesn't scare them the way it does others. And when you look closer at the psychology behind this, you start to see why these same people tend to be incredibly difficult to manipulate. It's all connected in ways that aren't immediately obvious, but once you understand it, everything makes sense. Let me explain what I mean. Most manipulation, whether it's subtle or overt, relies on a very specific set of emotional vulnerabilities: fear of rejection, need for approval, anxiety about being alone, discomfort with silence, desperation to be liked. When you think about it, almost every manipulative tactic you've ever encountered, whether in a relationship, a workplace, or even within family dynamics, exploits one of these core insecurities. The person doing the manipulating, consciously or unconsciously, is counting on you to react emotionally rather than logically. They're banking on the fact that you'll prioritize avoiding discomfort over protecting your own boundaries. But here's where it gets interesting. People who are comfortable being alone have already faced that discomfort. They've sat with the silence. They've spent time with their own thoughts, their own company, and discovered that it's not only tolerable, it's often preferable to the chaos and emotional noise that comes with certain kinds of social interaction. This isn't about being antisocial or damaged. It's about having developed a relationship with yourself that's strong enough that external validation becomes optional rather than essential. And once that shift happens, the entire game changes. Think about what happens when someone tries to manipulate you by withdrawing attention or affection. The silent treatment, for instance. It only works if you're afraid of that silence, if you're uncomfortable with the idea of being alone or cut off from someone's approval. But if you're already at peace with your own company, if solitude feels safe rather than threatening, tactic loses all its power. In fact, it often backfires because you're perfectly content to let that person sit in their silence while you go about your life unbothered. The manipulator expected you to chase them, to beg for their attention back, to compromise your boundaries just to end the discomfort. Instead, you're fine, and that completely dismantles their strategy. This is why emotional independence is so threatening to people who rely on control. It's not personal, it's structural. Manipulation depends on creating an emotional dependency, on making you feel like you need something from the other person that only they can provide. Approval, validation, love, belonging, stability. Whatever it is, the manipulator positions themselves as the gatekeeper of that resource, and then they use your need for it as leverage. But someone who has cultivated emotional independence has already done the internal work of meeting those needs themselves. They've learned to validate their own experiences, to trust their own judgment, to find peace in their own presence. They're not looking for someone else to complete them, because they're already whole, and this wholeness shows up in very practical ways. These people notice things. They pay attention to patterns. They watch what people do, not just what they say, and they give weight to actions over words. If someone tells them one thing, but consistently behaves in a way that contradicts it, they don't ignore that inconsistency. They don't make excuses for it or rationalize it away. They simply note it and adjust their expectations accordingly. This might sound cold, but it's actually just clear-headed. It's the ability to see reality as it is rather than as you wish it were. Consider what happens in a workplace when someone tries to manipulate you into taking on extra work that isn't your responsibility. They might frame it as being a team player, or they might imply that refusing would make you difficult or uncooperative. For someone who desperately needs approval from authority figures or peers, this can be incredibly effective. The fear of being seen negatively, of being excluded or judged, can override their better judgment. They say yes, even when they know they shouldn't, even when it's unfair, even when it damages their own well-being. But someone who's comfortable with the possibility of being misunderstood, someone who doesn't need constant validation from their colleagues or boss, can simply say no. Not rudely, not defensively, just clearly. They can set a boundary without needing to justify it with a 10-minute explanation or apology. And that calm refusal, that lack of emotional reactivity, often stops the manipulation in its tracks because there's nothing to push against. The same dynamic plays out in relationships, romantic partners, friendships, family members. Any of these can involve manipulative patterns, often without anyone fully realizing it. Someone might use guilt to control your choices. They might punish you emotionally when you don't behave the way they want. They might create drama or crisis to keep you focused on their needs rather than your own. These tactics work beautifully on people who are afraid of conflict, who can't tolerate the idea of someone being upset with them, who equate love with constant accommodation. But they fall flat with someone who has learned to sit with discomfort, who understands that another person's emotional reaction is not their responsibility to fix, who can distinguish between genuine care and emotional leverage. What really sets these people apart is their relationship with their own intuition. They've learned to trust that inner voice that says something feels off, even when they can't immediately articulate why. You know that feeling when someone's words seem right, but something in your gut is telling you not to believe them. Most people override that instinct because they've been taught to be polite, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to not make waves. They talk themselves out of their own perception because it feels uncomfortable to trust themselves over what they're being told. But people who are emotionally independent have developed a different relationship with that discomfort. They've learned that their intuition is often picking up on subtle cues that their conscious mind hasn't fully processed yet. So when something feels wrong, they pause. They create space. They don't rush to react or comply. And that pause is incredibly powerful because it gives them time to think, rather than simply respond emotionally. This is also why these people tend to be comfortable with silence in conversations. Most of us feel pressure to fill silence, to smooth over awkward moments, to keep things flowing pleasantly. But silence is actually an incredibly revealing tool. When you're comfortable with it, you can use it to observe. You can watch how the other person responds when you don't immediately agree or react. You can notice if they become uncomfortable, if they try to fill the space with more pressure or persuasion, if they respect your thoughtfulness or try to rush you into a decision. Manipulators hate silence from their targets because it means they're not in control of the emotional rhythm of the interaction. They thrive on keeping you reactive, keeping you responding, keeping you off balance. But when you're calm and still, when you're genuinely comfortable just being present without needing to perform or please, it completely disrupts their strategy. And here's something important to understand: this isn't about being cold or closed off. These people often have deep, meaningful relationships. They're capable of profound intimacy and connection. The difference is that their connections are chosen rather than needed. They engage with people because they genuinely want to, not because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. They can be vulnerable without being dependent. They can care deeply without losing themselves. And they can walk away from situations that don't serve them without falling apart, because their sense of self isn't contingent on any particular relationship continuing. This is what makes them so difficult to manipulate. Manipulation fundamentally requires leverage, and leverage requires dependency. If you're not dependent on someone for your sense of worth, for your emotional stability, for your identity, then they have nothing to leverage. They can't threaten to take away something you're not relying on them to provide. They can't dangle approval you're not desperately seeking. They can't create fear around consequences you're already prepared to accept. Think about the fear of being alone, which is one of the most powerful tools in any manipulator's arsenal. How many people stay in harmful relationships, tolerate disrespect, compromise their values, or ignore their own needs because they're terrified of being by themselves? The fear is so visceral, so overwhelming, that it overrides everything else. But for someone who has discovered that being alone is actually peaceful, maybe even preferable to being in the wrong company, that threat has no teeth. You can't scare someone with solitude when solitude is where they find their clarity and strength. What's really happening psychologically is that these people have developed what's called an internal locus of control. They believe that they have agency over their own lives, that their well-being comes primarily from their own choices and efforts, rather than from external circumstances or other people's opinions of them. This doesn't mean they think they control everything. They're not delusional. They understand that external factors matter, but they've learned to focus their energy on what they can actually influence: their own thoughts, their own reactions, their own boundaries, their own standards. And this internal focus makes them remarkably resilient, because they're not constantly looking outside themselves for permission to feel okay. In practical terms, this shows up in everyday moments. When someone tries to guilt them into something, they can recognize the tactic for what it is, without getting swept up in the emotion of it. When someone uses anger to intimidate them into backing down, they can remain calm and hold their ground. When someone tries to create urgency or pressure around a decision, they can slow down and take the time they need. When someone attempts to isolate them or make them feel like their perspective is wrong or crazy, they can trust their own experience. These aren't superhuman abilities. They're skills that develop naturally when you spend enough time with yourself to know yourself. When you've faced your own fears and found that you're capable of handling them. And this brings us to perhaps the most important point. None of this is about being born a certain way or having some special personality type. It's learned. It develops through experience, through trial and error, through the gradual process of choosing self-awareness over self-deception. Some people arrive at it earlier because circumstances forced them to become self-reliant. Maybe they grew up in environments where they couldn't depend on others for emotional support, so they learned to provide it for themselves. Maybe they went through relationships where they lost themselves completely and decided never to do that again. Maybe they simply spent enough time alone to realize it wasn't the punishment they'd been taught to fear. But regardless of how they got there, the key is that they made a choice, often repeatedly, in small moments, to prioritize their own peace over other people's comfort, to value honesty over harmony, to accept temporary discomfort in service of long-term integrity. And each time they made that choice, they reinforced their own strength. They proved to themselves that they could handle the consequences of setting boundaries, of saying no, of walking away, of being alone. And with each proof, their confidence grew. Not arrogant confidence, but quiet certainty. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it's simply true. So, when you encounter someone who seems mysteriously immune to the usual social pressures, who doesn't seem to need what most people need, who appears comfortable in their own company in a way that's almost unsettling to others, understand that you're seeing the result of this process. You're seeing someone who has done the internal work of becoming emotionally self-sufficient. And while that might make them harder to connect with in shallow ways, it also makes them incredibly valuable in genuine relationships, because they're choosing to be there, not because they need you to complete them, but because they genuinely want your presence in their life. This is not about isolation or avoiding human connection. It's about approaching connection from a place of wholeness rather than emptiness. It's about engaging with the world on your terms rather than constantly contorting yourself to meet others' expectations. It's about recognizing that being alone and being lonely are completely different experiences, and that solitude can actually be a profound source of strength, clarity, and peace. The real power in all of this is the freedom it provides. When you're not afraid of being alone, when you're not dependent on external validation, when you trust yourself more than you trust the pressure others put on you, you become incredibly difficult to control, not because you're rebellious or defiant, but because you're grounded. You know who you are, you know what matters to you, and you're willing to protect that, even if it means disappointing people, even if it means being misunderstood, even if it means walking a path that looks different from what others expect. This is the psychology behind why being alone feels better for some people, and why those same people tend to be the ones who see through manipulation, who maintain their boundaries, who don't get swept up in drama or emotional games. They've built a relationship with themselves that's stronger than the pull of external noise. And in a world that constantly demands your attention, your reaction, your compliance, your emotional energy, that kind of centered calm is not just rare, it's revolutionary. Remember this: being comfortable alone and being difficult to manipulate are not personality traits you're born with. They're not gifts bestowed on the lucky few. They're skills you develop through conscious choice, through self-awareness, through the willingness to face discomfort rather than avoid it. Anyone can strengthen their mental autonomy. Anyone can learn to trust themselves more than they trust the pressure around them. Anyone can discover that solitude isn't something to fear, but something to embrace. It starts with small choices, pausing before reacting, noticing your patterns, questioning what you've been taught to accept, protecting your peace even when it feels uncomfortable. And over time, those small choices compound into something powerful, a life lived on your terms, guided by your values, unshaken by the manipulations that move others. That's not luck, that's mastery. And it's available to anyone willing to choose awareness over reaction again and again, until it becomes who they are.